I thought I was just going to fix a woman's dying garden. But when Ruth Coleman looked me in the eyes and said, "You're so patient," unlike my ex-husband, I had no idea that those 7 words would lead to a neighborhood standoff, expose a pattern of abuse that had been hidden for years, and completely change both our lives forever. My name is Paul Reynolds, and at 28, I'm what you might call a professional second chance giver. Not by choice, mind you. But life has a funny way of teaching you patience, whether you want to learn it or not. 5 years ago, I was on. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Track to become a civil engineer, had the degree, the internship lined up, even a decent apartment in the city. Then my dad had his stroke. Mom couldn't handle the medical bills and Dad's care alone. So I moved back to Millfield, a small town about 40 minutes outside Portland, Oregon. It's the kind of place where everyone knows your business before you do, where the local diner still has a jukebox that plays songs from the 70s, and where people actually wave at each other from their porches. I traded my engineering dreams for a landscaping business, and honestly, some days I wondered if the plants were more predictable than people. Turns out I was dead wrong about that. The transition wasn't easy. It's going from calculating load-bearing structures to calculating soil pH levels felt like a step backward, even though I knew it wasn't. My younger sister Nara always said I had a gift with growing things, apparently. I'd been unconsciously preparing for this career change since I was 12 and started that vegetable garden behind our garage. Still, there were nights I'd lie, awake wondering if I'd made the right choice, if I was wasting my education, if Dad would have wanted me to sacrifice my future for his present. But Millfield grew on me, literally and figuratively. There's something deeply satisfying about taking something broken or neglected and watching it come back to life. Whether it's a flower bed choked with weeds or a lawn that looks like it survived a drought, I learned that patience and persistence could work miracles. My clients started calling me the plant whisperer, which was embarrassing, but good for business. I specialized in what I called rescue gardening, taking on the cases other landscapers avoided, the yards that looked hopeless, the gardens that had been abandoned for years, the outdoor spaces that seemed beyond saving. Word spread, and soon I had a waiting list of people who wanted someone who wouldn't give up on their green spaces. That's how I ended up with a call from Ruth Coleman on a rainy Thursday morning in early March. "Mr. Reynolds." The voice on the phone was hesitant, almost embarrassed. "I heard you might be able to help with what I guess you'd call a garden emergency." I was sitting in my truck outside Henderson's Hardware, rain drumming on the roof, trying to decide whether to make another supply run or call it a day. The voice belonged to a woman who sounded like she was in her 40s, maybe early 50s, with that particular strain people get when they're trying to ask for help but aren't used to needing it. "I can certainly take a look," I said, grabbing my appointment book from the glove compartment. "What kind of emergency are we talking about?" There was a pause, and I could hear what sounded like wind chimes in the background, along with the distant sound of traffic. "It's my backyard garden. I've been trying to save it for almost a year now, but everything I touch just dies. My neighbor, Mrs. Whitmore, said you specialize in hopeless cases." Something in her voice made me sit up straighter. It wasn't just about plants. There was a weariness there, a defeat that went deeper than gardening failures. "There's no such thing as a hopeless case, Mrs. Coleman. Ruth Coleman. And I live at 847 Maple Street, the blue house with the white shutters." Though honestly, the garden might be visible from space at this point, and not in a good way. I knew the street. Maple was one of those older neighborhoods where the houses had character and the yards had potential, assuming someone knew what they were doing. "I could swing by tomorrow morning around 9, take a look and give you an assessment. No charge for the consultation." "Really?" The relief in her voice was immediate. That would be wonderful. Fair warning, though, it's pretty bad. My ex-husband always said I had a black thumb in looking at my backyard. I'm starting to think he might have been right about that. The way she said ex's band carried weight, like there was a whole story packed into those 2 words. I made a note in my book. Ruth Coleman, 847 Maple Street, 9 a.m. garden rescue mission. "Mrs. Coleman, I've seen gardens that looked like war zones come back to life. Sometimes plants just need someone who's willing to take their time with them. I'll see you tomorrow morning. After I hung up, I sat in the truck for a few more minutes, watching the rain create rivers down the windshield. There had been something in Ruth Coleman's voice that stuck with me, not just the embarrassment about her failing garden. Something deeper, sadness that made me think this wasn't really about plants at all. I'd learned over the years that people don't just call landscapers to fix their yards. Sometimes they call because they need to fix something inside themselves, and working with their hands in the dirt is the only way they know how to start. Sometimes they call because they're lonely and desperate for someone to talk to who won't judge them for letting things fall apart. Sometimes they call because they're looking for proof that broken things can be made beautiful again. I had no way of knowing which category Ruth Coleman fell into, but something told me I was about to find out. As I drove home through the rain, past the familiar streets of Millfield, with their modest houses and overgrown yards, I found myself looking forward to tomorrow morning in a way I hadn't expected. Little did I know that 847 Maple Street would become the address where everything changed. The next morning came with one of those crisp March days that makes you believe spring might actually show up on time. I loaded my truck with the basic assessment tools, soil pH kit, measuring tape, pruning shears, and my trusty notebook where I recorded everything from plant varieties to client preferences. The drive to Maple Street took me through the heart of Millfield, past the elementary school where kids were already outside for recess, past Murphy's Diner where the Friday morning coffee crowd gathered around tables that had probably hosted the same conversations for decades. 847 Maple Street sat on a corner lot, and Ruth Coleman hadn't been exaggerating when she said the garden problems were visible from space. The blue house with white shutters was charming enough, a 1940s cottage with good bones and a wraparound porch that suggested better days. But the backyard was a different story entirely. From my truck, I could see over the low chain-link fence that separated the property from the sidewalk. What had once been a garden looked like nature had declared war on itself and lost. Overgrown weeds tangled with the skeletal remains of what might have been rose bushes. A vegetable patch had surrendered to crabgrass and dandelions. Flower beds were indistinguishable from the lawn, which itself was a patchwork of brown spots and aggressive weeds that seemed to mock any kempt cultivation. But it wasn't just neglect I was seeing. There was something deliberate about the destruction, like someone had taken a thriving garden and systematically ruined it. Plants that should have been pruned were snapped off. Sprinkler heads were twisted at odd angles. A wooden garden arbor lay on its side, not fallen, but pushed over, its white paint peeling and one side completely splintered. I sat in my truck for a moment, engine idling, trying to piece together what I was looking at. This wasn't just a case of someone who didn't know how to garden. This looked like sabotage. The front door opened before I could knock, and Ruth Coleman stepped onto the porch. She was smaller than I'd imagined for. After I hung up, I sat in the truck for a few more minutes, watching the rain create rivers down the windshield. There had been something in Ruth Coleman's voice that stuck with me, not just the embarrassment about her failing garden. Something deeper, sadness that made me think this wasn't really about plants at all. I'd learned over the years that people don't just call landscapers to fix their yards. Sometimes they call because they need to fix something inside themselves, and working with their hands in the dirt is the only way they know how to start. Sometimes they call because they're lonely and desperate for someone to talk to who won't judge them for letting things fall apart. Sometimes they call because they're looking for proof that broken things can be made beautiful again. I had no way of knowing which category Ruth Coleman fell into, but something told me I was about to find out. As I drove home through the rain, past the familiar streets of Millfield, with their modest houses and overgrown yards, I found myself looking forward to tomorrow morning in a way I hadn't expected. Little did I know that 847 Maple Street would become the address where everything changed. The next morning came with one of those crisp March days that makes you believe spring might actually show up on time. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I loaded my truck with the basic assessment tools, soil pH kit, measuring tape, pruning shears, and my trusty notebook where I recorded everything from plant varieties to client preferences. The drive to Maple Street took me through the heart of Millfield. Ruth wrapped her arms around herself, even though the morning wasn't particularly cold. It's been gradual. Started about 18 months ago, right around the time my divorce was finalized. She paused, and I could feel her watching me carefully, like she was trying to gauge my reaction. My ex-husband, Stephen, he used to help with the garden. Well, help isn't the right word. He used to control it. Every plant, every design choice, every watering schedule had to be exactly the way he wanted it. I kept my eyes on the soil, giving her space to talk. I'd learned that sometimes people needed to tell you the whole story before you could understand what you were really being asked to fix. After the divorce, I thought I could finally make it mine, you know? I'd plant the flowers I wanted, design it the way I'd always imagined. But everything started dying. First, I thought it was just me, that maybe Stephen was right, and I really didn't know anything about gardening. She knelt down beside me, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. But then I started noticing things. Plants that had been fine in the evening would be broken or uprooted in the morning. The irrigation system that worked perfectly would suddenly malfunction. Tools would go missing or turn up broken. I looked up at her then and saw something in her eyes that made my chest tighten. It was the look of someone who'd been gaslit so thoroughly that they questioned their own perceptions of reality. "Ruth," I said gently, "this isn't your fault. It's not because you can't garden." Her eyes filled with tears she obviously didn't want to shed. "How can you tell?" I stood up and gestured toward the mess around us, because whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Look at how the roses were cut, not pruned, but deliberately damaged at the graft union. These sprinkler heads were twisted off with tools, not broken by accident. In this soil, I grabbed a handful and let it run through my fingers. This soil is good, really good. Someone spent years building up this earth. You can't fake that kind of foundation. Ruth stared at me like I'd just spoken a foreign language. "You really think it can be saved?" I smiled at her, the first real smile I'd given since arriving. "Mrs. Coleman, I don't just think it can be saved. I think it's going to be beautiful. It's more beautiful than it ever was before." For the first time since I'd arrived, Ruth Coleman smiled back. It was tentative and fragile, but it was real. "When can we start? When can we start?" Ruth had asked, and something in her voice, a mixture of hope and desperation, made me want to drop everything and begin immediately. But I'd learned the hard way that rushing into garden restoration was like trying to rebuild a relationship. You had to lay the groundwork carefully, or everything would fall apart again. "Well," I said, pulling out my notebook, "first I need to understand what we're working with. Mind if I ask you some questions about the garden's history?" Ruth nodded eagerly, and I could see her visibly relax as we settled into what felt like a more normal conversation. We sat on the back steps of her porch. The devastated garden spread out before us like a crime scene that needed careful investigation. "This soil," I said, letting another handful run through my fingers. "Someone put years of work into building this up. Was that you?" For the first time since I'd arrived, Ruth's expression brightened with something that looked like pride. "My grandmother, actually. This was her house originally. She started this garden in 1962, right after my grandfather came back from Vietnam. She always said that growing things helped her forget about the things that couldn't grow back." She pointed toward what had once been a rose bed. Those were her roses, heirloom varieties that she grafted herself. Mr. Lincoln, Double Delight, and a climbing rose called Eden that covered the entire back fence. She spent 40 years perfecting this space. I could hear the love in her voice when she talked about her grandmother, and also the pain of seeing that legacy destroyed. "How did you end up with the house?" "Grandma left it to me when she passed 5 years ago. Stephen and I moved in right after we got married." Ruth's voice changed when she mentioned her ex-husband, becoming flatter, more guarded. At first, he seemed to appreciate the garden. He'd work out here for hours, said it relaxed him after his construction jobs. She stood up and walked over to where the garden arbor lay broken. "He built this arbor for our first anniversary, said it would be perfect for the climbing roses." I thought it was the most romantic thing anyone had ever done for me. I joined, her by the fallen structure, examining the splintered wood. What changed? Ruth was quiet for a long moment, running her fingers along the broken slats. Stephen, ... He wasn't an easy man to live with. First, I thought his intensity was passion. He cared so much about everything being perfect, the house, the garden, me. But after a while, I realized it wasn't about perfection. It was about control. She wrapped her arms around herself again, a gesture I was beginning to recognize as her way of self-soothing. He'd spend hours out here, but it wasn't relaxing anymore. He'd get angry if I moved a plant without asking. He'd redo work I'd done, claiming I'd done it wrong. Eventually, I just stopped trying. It was easier to let him have the garden than to fight about it. I felt a familiar anger building in my chest, not at Ruth, but at the man who had systematically stripped away her confidence in something she clearly loved. When did it start getting physical? The question came out before I could stop myself, and I immediately regretted being so direct. But Ruth didn't seem surprised that I'd asked. "You can tell?" she said quietly. "I've seen this pattern before. The need to control everything, the systematic destruction of something that brings you joy. It usually escalates." Ruth nodded slowly. "It started small. He'd grab my wrist too hard when he was explaining the right way to prune something. Then it became shoving when I'd accidentally overwater a section he'd just planted. By the end, I was afraid to go into my own backyard without permission. She turned to look at me then, and I could see she was testing my reaction, waiting for me to make excuses for him or minimize what she'd experienced. Instead, I said, "I'm sorry that happened to you. I'm glad you got out." Something in Ruth's posture shifted, her shoulders dropped slightly, and she exhaled like she'd been holding her breath. The divorce was finalized 14 months ago. I thought it would be over then, but ... But he's still coming around. Not officially. He's careful about that. But things keep happening. At first I thought maybe it was just bad luck, or that I really was as hopeless with plants as he always said. But the timing, it always happens right after I've had a good day, you know. Like he can sense when I'm starting to feel optimistic about something. I looked around the destroyed garden with new eyes, seeing not just sabotage, but a calculated campaign of psychological warfare. How often? It's every few weeks. Sometimes it's small, a sprinkler head twisted off, a few plants mysteriously dead. Sometimes it's bigger, like when he pushed over the arbor last month. Ruth's voice grew smaller. "I called the police once, but there's never any proof. And Stephen knows how to talk to people. He's charming when he wants to be. This makes me sound like a paranoid ex-wife who can't accept that her marriage is over." The anger I felt was white-hot now, but I kept my voice steady. "Ruth, I want you to know something. This isn't about gardening anymore, if it ever was. This is about someone trying to steal your joy, your confidence, your sense of home, and we're not going to let him do that." Ruth stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her trying to decide whether to trust me. I'm not just going to fix your garden and walk away. Not when someone's actively trying to destroy it. If you'll let me, I'd like to help you reclaim this space. Really reclaim it. Make it yours in a way it never was before. For the first time since I'd arrived, I saw something fierce flicker in Ruth's green eyes. "You'd do that? Even knowing that he might just destroy it again?" I smiled and gestured toward the broken garden around us. "Ruth, I specialize in bringing dead things back to life." Ow. She laughed then, a real laugh that transformed her entire face. "You know, I think my grandmother would have liked you. She was stubborn too." "Tell me about her garden," I said, settling back onto the porch steps. "I want to know exactly what we're bringing back to life." For the next hour, Ruth told me stories about her grandmother's garden, how she'd saved seeds from every successful plant and traded cuttings with neighbors, how she'd composted religiously and never used chemicals because she believed in working with nature instead of against it, how she'd taught a young Ruth the names of every flower and the secret to keeping roses blooming all season long. As Ruth talked, I could see the woman she'd been before Stephen Coleman tried to erase her. Someone passionate and knowledgeable and deeply connected to the earth. Someone worth fighting for. "All right," I said finally, closing my notebook. "I think I understand what we're dealing with. Question is, are you ready to get your hands dirty?" Ruth looked out at the devastated garden, then back at me. "I've been ready for 14 months. Just didn't know how to start." I stood up and extended my hand to help her up.
Oh, well, Mrs. Coleman, we start with one plant at a time.
And we don't let anyone make us doubt that we can make beautiful things grow. The following Monday morning, I arrived at Ruth's house with my truck loaded down like I was planning to terraform Mars. Bags of compost, mulch, and soil amendments filled the bed, along with my collection of hand tools that had seen me through countless garden resurrections. I'd spent the weekend researching heirloom rose varieties and drawing up plans for what Ruth's grandmother's garden could become with some modern touches. Ruth was waiting for me on the porch, already dressed in work clothes, newer jeans without holes, and a gardening shirt that still had creases from the package. She'd clearly gone shopping over the weekend, and something about that small act of preparation told me she was serious about this project. I brought coffee, she said, holding up a thermos and 2 mugs, and I may have gotten a little carried away at the garden center yesterday. She led me around to the side yard, where she'd arranged what looked like a small nursery, flats of seedlings, bags of bulbs, and several potted plants that were clearly impulse purchases. I recognized marigolds, petunias, some herb starts, and what appeared to be 3 different varieties of tomatoes. I know I probably went overboard, Ruth said, sounding almost embarrassed, but it's been so long since I've been able to choose plants for myself. I kept walking through the aisles thinking, I can plant whatever I want now. I smiled, examining her selections. They were all good choices, hardy plants that would thrive in Oregon's climate and provide color throughout the growing season. This is perfect, actually. Shows me what you're drawn to naturally. Your grandmother would approve. We spent the first hour walking through the garden with my notebook, me asking questions and Ruth sharing memories. I learned that her grandmother had divided the space into distinct areas: a formal rose garden near the house, a cottage garden full of wildflowers and herbs along the side fence, a vegetable patch in the sunniest corner, and a quiet seating area under an old oak tree where she'd drink her morning coffee. The oak tree is the only thing Stephen never touched, Ruth said, running her hand along its massive trunk. I think even he recognized that some things are bigger than his need to control everything. I looked up into the canopy, noting the strong branches and healthy leaves. Good thing, too. This tree is probably 80 years old. It's going to be the backbone of everything we rebuild here. As we worked to clear the first section, what would become the new cottage garden, I found myself studying Ruth as much as the plants. She moved carefully at first, like she was expecting someone to criticize her technique, but gradually relaxed as I showed her how to identify which plants could be saved versus which ones needed to go. You've got good instincts, I told her as she successfully identified a patch of oregano that had somehow survived the destruction. Most people would have overlooked that completely. Ruth beamed at the compliment, and I realized how starved she'd been for positive reinforcement. My grandmother always said I had her hands, I just... I'd forgotten. We worked steadily through the morning, pulling weeds and clearing debris. I'd learned over the years that the physical act of garden work often opened people up in ways that sitting and talking never could. There was something about having your hands in the dirt that made conversations flow more naturally. Can I ask you something? Ruth said as we took a break around noon, sitting under the oak tree with sandwiches she'd made. Yesterday, when you said you'd seen this pattern before, what did you mean? I set down my sandwich, choosing my words. Carefully, at a client about 3 years ago, Christine Richards. Similar situation, garden that kept mysteriously failing, ex-husband who couldn't seem to let go. Took me weeks to figure out what was really going on. What happened? She was afraid to tell me at first, just like you were. But eventually, she admitted that he'd been coming around, always finding excuses, claiming he'd left tools behind, or needed to check on a tree he'd planted. Each time, something would be damaged after he left. Ruth nodded grimly. That sounds familiar. Stephen still has his key, technically. The lawyer said I could change the locks, but Stephen argued that he needed access to retrieve his belongings. It's been 14 months. And somehow he's still finding things he forgot. Christine changed her locks, I said. Best decision she ever made. Her garden is thriving now, and she's engaged to a guy who builds raised beds in his spare time instead of tearing them down. For the first time in our conversations, Ruth looked genuinely hopeful. You think? You think it's possible for me to have that? A normal relationship where someone supports what I love instead of trying to destroy it? The question caught me off guard, and I found myself looking at Ruth, really looking at her. She had dirt under her fingernails and a smudge of soil on her cheek. And when she talked about her grandmother or got excited about a plant we'd saved, her whole face transformed. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with makeup or fancy clothes and everything to do with passion and resilience. I think, I said carefully, that any man would be lucky to share a garden with you. Ruth blushed and looked away, but she was smiling. You're just being nice. I'm really not. I've worked with a lot of people over the years, and there's something special about someone who can see potential in broken things. That's a rare quality. We worked through the afternoon, and I noticed Ruth becoming more confident with each task. When she successfully transplanted a section of daylilies that had been growing in the wrong spot, she actually cheered. When she identified a volunteer tomato plant growing among the weeds, she called me over like she'd discovered buried treasure. Look at this little guy, she said, carefully digging around the seedling. He just refused to give up, didn't he? Determined little survivor, I agreed. Reminds me of someone else I know. As the day wound down, we stood back to survey our progress. We'd cleared about a quarter of the garden, revealing the good bones underneath the damage. The work was far from finished, but you could already see the potential emerging. Paul, Ruth said quietly, I need to tell you something. I turned to face her, noting the serious tone in her voice. When you asked if I was ready to get my hands dirty, I said I'd been ready for 14 months. But that wasn't entirely true. She took a deep breath. The truth is, I've been scared. Scared that if I try to make this beautiful again, he'll just destroy it worse than before. Scared that maybe he was right, and I really am hopeless at this. She looked around at the progress we'd made, but today, I remembered what it felt like to plant something with hope instead of fear. I realized that I'd rather have a garden that gets destroyed than no garden at all. I felt something shift in my chest, pride in her courage, and something else I wasn't quite ready to name. Ruth, you're not hopeless. You're brave. Braver than you know. She smiled at me then, and for a moment, standing in the golden light. Afternoon light surrounded by the beginnings of her new garden, everything felt possible. Same time tomorrow? I asked, starting to pack up my tools. I'll be here, Ruth said, with coffee, and probably more impulse purchases from the garden center. As I drove home that evening, I found myself thinking about Christine Richards and her happy ending. For the first time in years, I wondered what my own happy ending might look like. By the end of our second week working together, Ruth's garden was beginning to show signs of real transformation. The cottage garden section was cleared and planted with a riot of colors, the marigolds and petunias she'd chosen. Along with some native wildflowers I'd suggested that would attract butterflies, the herb section was thriving with basil, oregano, and thyme sending their fragrant signals that life was returning to this space. But more than the garden was changing. Ruth herself seemed to be blooming alongside her plants. She'd stopped wearing the oversized cardigan that had seemed like armor, and her movements in the garden were becoming more confident, more natural. She'd remembered techniques her grandmother had taught her decades ago. I'd catch her humming while she worked, conscious little melodies that told me she was finally feeling at peace in her own backyard. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Ruth had coffee ready when I arrived, and we fell into our comfortable routine of planning the day's work over breakfast on the back porch. But as we walked out to the garden, both of us stopped short. Someone had been there during the night. Damage wasn't as extensive as it had been before we started, but it was surgical in its cruelty. The tomato plants Ruth had been particularly proud of were snapped off at ground level. The new rose bush we'd planted in honor of her grandmother, a double delight variety I'd special ordered, had been dug up and left lying on its side, roots exposed to the air. But what made my blood boil was what had been done to the herb garden. Someone had poured salt directly onto the basil plants Ruth had been babying for 2 weeks. The leaves were already turning black and withered. I looked at Ruth, expecting to see the defeated expression I'd witnessed that first day. Instead, I saw something that surprised me. Anger. Pure, righteous anger. That son of a bitch, she said quietly, her hands clenched into fists. Those herbs, I grew those from seeds my grandmother saved. I knelt down next to the damaged plants, examining them carefully. Some of these can be saved, I said. The damage looks worse than it is. Ruth knelt beside me, her jaw set in determination. How can you tell? I pointed to where new growth was already emerging from the base of one of the tomato plants. See this? The root system is still strong. Plants are incredibly resilient when they have good foundations. For the next hour, we worked together to assess and repair the damage. Ruth's hands were steady as she helped me carefully replant the rose bush, and she listened intently as I explained how to check for root damage and which branches could be saved. It was while we were working on saving a particularly stubborn oregano plant that she said it. I was showing her how to gently separate the damaged roots from the healthy ones, my hands guiding hers as we worked together to give the plant its best chance at survival. The morning sun was filtering through the oak tree, and there was something peaceful about the moment despite the destruction we were repairing. You know, Ruth said softly, not looking up from the plant we were working on, you're so patient with them, like my ex-husband. She paused, her hands stilling in the soil. Stephen would have just ripped the whole thing out and thrown it away, said it wasn't worth the effort to save something that was damaged. I felt something shift in the air between us, like she was telling me something about more than just plants. He used to say that about a lot of things, she continued, finally looking up at me. That once something was broken, it wasn't worth fixing. That it was easier to start over with something new than to put in the work to heal what was hurt. Our eyes met, and I saw something vulnerable and hopeful in her expression that made my chest tighten. But watching you work, she said, seeing how you take time with each plant, how you believe they can recover even when they look hopeless, ... It makes me think maybe he was wrong about that. Maybe broken things can be beautiful again if someone is willing to be patient with them. The oregano plant sat between us, its damaged roots carefully separated and ready for replanting, but neither of us moved. The morning felt suspended, like the whole garden was holding its breath. Ruth, I said quietly, I think your ex-husband was wrong about a lot of things. She smiled then, not the tentative, fragile smile I'd grown used to, but something warmer and more confident. You know, in all my 43 years, I don't think anyone has ever been as patient with me as you've been with this garden. As you've been with me, the words hung in the air between us, and I realized that somewhere between the soil tests and the morning coffee, between the stories about her grandmother and the quiet fury over the nighttime sabotage, I had fallen. For Ruth Coleman, not just her resilience or her determination, but her kindness, her quick laugh, and the way she saw potential in the smallest surviving seedling. Maybe, I said, my voice rougher than I intended, that says more about the people in your life than it does about you. Ruth's cheeks flushed pink, but she didn't look away. Maybe it does. We planted the oregano together, our hands brushing in the soil, and I knew that whatever was growing between us was just as real and just as worth nurturing as anything in her grandmother's garden. Word travels fast in a town like Millfield. And by Thursday morning, it seemed like half the neighborhood knew about Ruth Coleman's garden project. I was unloading mulch from my truck when I noticed a woman in her 60s watching me from the sidewalk. She had silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and wore a floral house dress that looked like it belonged in a Norman Rockwell painting. Must be the young man helping Ruth with her garden, she called out, approaching with a plate covered in aluminum foil. I'm Aster Whitmore. I live next door. I wiped my hands on my jeans before accepting her handshake. Paul Reynolds. Nice too. Meet you, Mrs. Whitmore. Oh, call me Aster, honey. Mrs. Whitmore makes me sound ancient. She glanced toward Ruth's backyard, her expression growing serious. That poor girl has been through enough. It's about time someone helped her reclaim that space. She handed me the covered plate. Blueberry muffins. Ruth mentioned you've been working hard out here, and a man needs proper fuel for proper work. Before I could thank her, Ruth appeared from the backyard, her face lighting up when she saw Aster. I thought I heard voices. Aster, you didn't need to bring food. Nonsense. Aster waved her hand dismissively. Besides, I wanted to meet this miracle worker you've been telling everyone about. She winked at me. Ruth can't stop talking about how you've transformed not just her garden, but her whole outlook. Ruth blushed prettily. Aster, you're embarrassing him. Good, Aster laughed. Nice young men should be embarrassed occasionally. Keeps them humble. She turned back to me. Oh, what can I do to help? I may be 64, but I can still pull weeds with the best of them. That's how our duo became a trio. Aster proved to be a wealth of knowledge about the neighborhoods, gardening history, and had an endless supply of stories about Ruth's grandmother. She also had opinions about everything and wasn't shy about sharing them. Ruth's grandmother, God rest her soul, had the most beautiful compost system you ever saw, Aster said as we worked to prepare a new planting bed. She used to say that good soil was like a good marriage. It needed the right ingredients, proper attention, and time to develop. We were interrupted by the sound of someone clearing their throat. A lanky man in his early 30s stood at the garden gate wearing a postal uniform and looking nervous. Sorry to interrupt, he said, adjusting his mailbag. I'm Johnny Whitmore, Aster's nephew. Did she mention you might need some extra hands? Aster beamed. Johnny's been wanting to meet you both. He's quite the gardener himself, grows prize-winning tomatoes. Johnny shuffled his feet. I wouldn't say prize-winning exactly. ... Humble to a fault, Aster stage-whispered to Ruth and me, just like his mother raised him. As Johnny joined our work crew, I learned he was the local mail carrier who'd been quietly concerned about Ruth for months. I deliver her mail every day, he said, as we worked together to install a new irrigation line. After the divorce, I could see how the garden was deteriorating. But I didn't know how to offer help without seeming intrusive. You should have just asked, Ruth said, smiling at him. I would have welcomed the company. Stephen didn't much like neighbors getting involved in his business, Johnny replied quietly, made it clear that help wasn't wanted. The mention of Stephen's name cast a brief shadow over our pleasant morning, but Aster quickly redirected the conversation. Well, Stephen's not here now, is he? Then this garden is going to be the envy of the entire street by the time we're finished. Noon, another neighbor appeared, Christine Reynolds. A woman in her late 30s with paint-stained hands and an infectious laugh. No relation to me, despite the shared last name, but she lived 3 houses down and had been watching our progress with growing interest. I hope you don't mind the intrusion, Christine said, but I brought iced tea and sandwiches. Figured you could use a break. She spread a checkered tablecloth under the oak tree, and suddenly, our work session had turned into an impromptu neighborhood picnic. As we ate, I found myself watching Ruth interact with her neighbors and realized this was probably the first time in years she'd felt truly supported by her community. You know, Christine said, biting into her sandwich, I've been wanting to start a neighborhood garden club. Maybe we could use Ruth's garden as our inspiration? That's a wonderful idea, Aster exclaimed. We could meet monthly, share plants. And advice. And keep an eye on things, Johnny added quietly, his meaning clear without being explicit. Ruth looked around at the faces gathered under her grandmother's oak tree, people who barely knew her, but were already treating her like family. I'd love that, she said, and I could hear the emotion in her voice as the afternoon wore on. Our little group worked with the easy camaraderie of people who'd found a common purpose. Aster regaled us with neighborhood gossip, while expertly the marigolds. Johnny proved to have an encyclopedic knowledge of plant diseases and their treatments. Christine had an artistic eye for color combinations that elevated our basic plantings into something that looked intentionally designed. But it was watching Ruth, in the center of it all, that made my chest tight with something I was finally ready to call affection. She moved through her garden with growing confidence, directing our efforts and making decisions about plant placement with the authority of someone who finally felt at home in her own space. You know, Aster said as we packed up for the day, your grandmother would be so proud of what you're doing here. Ruth. She always said this garden was meant to bring people together. Ruth's eyes filled with happy tears. She'd always say that gardens were for sharing. As our new garden club dispersed, each neighbor promising to return the following day, I found myself looking forward to tomorrow's work in a way that had nothing to do with landscaping and everything to do with watching Ruth bloom alongside her plants. Thank you, Ruth said quietly as I loaded my tools, Not just for the garden, but for ... this. She gestured toward where our neighbors had been working. I forgot what it felt like to have people care. Get used to it, I said, surprising myself with the roughness in my voice. Because something tells me this is just the beginning. The first sign that our peaceful garden project was about to become something more complicated came on a Friday morning when Johnny arrived for his mail delivery looking unusually troubled. Ruth and I were transplanting some lavender starts that Christine had brought over, and Aster was deadheading roses while humming what sounded like a hymn from her childhood. "Morning, everyone," Johnny said, but his usual cheerful greeting was strained. He approached Ruth with her mail, but instead of his normal quick handoff, he lingered. "Ruth, I probably shouldn't say anything, but..." He glanced around our little group, then lowered his voice. "I've been noticing some things on my route. Stephen's been asking questions about you to other neighbors. Mrs. Patterson down the street said he stopped by yesterday, claiming he was worried about your mental state because of all the activity happening in your yard." Ruth's face went pale, and I felt my hands clench involuntarily around the lavender plant I was holding. "What kind of questions?" "He's telling people that you're becoming obsessed with gardening, that you're spending money you don't have on plants, and that you're..." Johnny hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "He's suggesting that you're not handling the divorce well, and that maybe someone should check on you." Aster's humming stopped abruptly. "That manipulative piece of garbage," she said, her usually sweet voice turning steel hard. "I've lived next door to Ruth for 3 years. She's never been more stable or happy than she has these past few weeks." "There's more," Johnny continued reluctantly. "He's also been asking about Paul specifically. Wants to know who hired him, how long he's been working here, whether Ruth is paying him properly for his services." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. He's fishing for something to use against her. Ruth sank down onto the garden bench we'd installed under the oak tree, her face in her hands. "This is exactly what he used to do during our marriage. If I started enjoying something or made a new friend, he'd find a way to twist it into evidence that I was unstable or making poor decisions." Christine, who had arrived just in time to hear Johnny's report, sat down next to Ruth and put an arm around her shoulders. "What exactly is he trying to accomplish?" "Control," I said, the word coming out harsher than I intended. "He can't stand that Ruth is building a life without him, especially one where she's happy." Ruth looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "Maybe we should stop. Maybe this whole project is just giving him ammunition to..." "Absolutely not," Aster interrupted firmly. "Ruth Coleman, you listen to me. Your grandmother didn't spend 40 years building this garden so you could let some bully scare you away from it. But what if he tries to use this against me somehow? What if he finds a way to make it seem like I'm being irresponsible, or then..." "We make sure he can't," I said, my mind already working through possibilities. "Johnny, what exactly has he been telling people?" Johnny pulled out a small notebook. Apparently he'd been keeping track. "He told Mrs. Patterson that Ruth has been acting erratically since the divorce, spending her grocery money on plants and hiring strange men to work on her property. He suggested to Mr. Chen that she might be having some kind of breakdown and that concerned neighbors should document any unusual behavior. He's building a case," Christine said grimly, "making it look like Ruth is mentally unstable so he can... What? Try to have her committed? Contest the divorce settlement?" Ruth's voice was barely a whisper. "The house. In the divorce, I got the house because it was my grandmother's. But Stephen argued that if I couldn't maintain it properly, it should be sold and the proceeds split. The judge said the matter was settled, but if Stephen could prove I was ... incompetent ... Pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Stephen wasn't just trying to hurt Ruth emotionally. He was systematically building a case to challenge her fitness to own her grandmother's house. "That's why he's been sabotaging the garden," I said. "Every time we make progress, he destroys. It then tells the neighbors that Ruth's gardening projects keep failing because she's not thinking clearly." Aster stood up with the kind of determined energy that suggested Stephen Coleman had no idea what he was up against. "Well, then we're going to have to be smarter than he is." "What do you mean?" Ruth asked. Aster said that it's time to stop being reactive and start being proactive. If Stephen wants to play games with the truth, then we need to make sure the real truth is documented and witnessed. Johnny nodded slowly. I could keep a log of when I see him in the neighborhood. Mail carriers are considered reliable witnesses, and I could start taking photos, Christine added. Document the garden's progress. Show that Ruth is making thoughtful improvements to her property, not creating chaos. I looked at Ruth, who seemed overwhelmed by the idea that people were willing to go to such lengths to protect her. Ruth, there's something else we need to consider. If Stephen is escalating his campaign against you, the sabotage might get worse too. As if summoned by our conversation, we all heard the sound of a truck pulling up in front of the house. Through the garden gate, I could see a familiar silhouette in the driver's seat, broad shoulders, dark hair, and an aggressive posture that radiated hostility even from a distance. Speak of the devil, Astor muttered. Stephen Coleman sat in his truck for a long moment, clearly watching our group through the fence. I could feel the tension radiating from Ruth, and I moved closer to her instinctively. He's just trying to intimidate you, I said quietly. Don't let him see that it's working. But Ruth was staring at the truck with something that looked less like fear and more like resolve. You know what? I'm tired of being afraid of him. This is my house, my garden, my life. If he wants to watch me be happy, then let him watch. She stood up from the bench and walked deliberately to the garden gate, where Stephen could see her clearly. Then she turned back to our group and said loudly enough for her voice to carry, Paul, could you show me again how to properly stake those tomatoes? I want to make sure I'm doing it right. Stephen's engine revved once, a sound that might have been accidental, but felt like a threat. Then he drove away, leaving us standing in Ruth's garden with the clear understanding that this was no longer just about plants and soil. This was war. Stephen's intimidation. Drive-by had the opposite effect of what he'd intended. Instead of scaring our little garden club into submission, it galvanized us into action. By Monday morning, Astor had organized what she called Operation Garden Defense. With the efficiency of a retired military strategist, I've lived in this neighborhood for 37 years, she announced as our group gathered under the oak tree. I've seen bullies come and go. The one thing they all have in common is that they only pick on people they think are isolated and helpless. She pulled out a notebook that would have made Johnny's mail carrier organization skills look amateur. So we're going to make sure Stephen Coleman understands that Ruth is neither isolated nor helpless. Christine had arrived with her camera and a folder full of printed photographs. I've been documenting everything, she said, spreading the images. Across our makeshift table, look at this progression, Ruth's garden 3 weeks ago versus now. Transformation was remarkable. Where once there had been destruction and neglect, the photos now showed carefully tended beds, thriving plants, and thoughtful landscape design. Ruth looked at the images with something approaching amazement. I didn't realize how much we'd accomplished, she said softly. It actually looks like a real garden again. More than that, I said, studying Christine's photos. It looks like the work of someone who knows exactly what she's doing. These aren't the choices of someone having a mental breakdown. They're the decisions of someone with vision and skill. Johnny had been unusually quiet during our planning session, but now he cleared his throat. I need to tell you all something. Stephen approached me directly yesterday. The mood around our table shifted immediately. Ruth's face went pale, and I felt my jaw clench. He was waiting by my mail truck when I finished the route, Johnny continued. Started off friendly, asking how I knew Ruth, whether I'd noticed any concerning behavior. When I told him Ruth seemed perfectly fine to me, he got more direct. Astor leaned forward. Direct how? He offered me money, said he was just worried about his ex-wife's well-being and wanted someone reliable to keep an eye on her, someone who could document if she started acting erratically or making poor financial decisions. Ruth's hand started to tremble. He wanted you to spy on me. I told him where he could stick his offer, Johnny said firmly. But he didn't take it well. Started talking about how divorce can make people vindictive, how ex-wives sometimes make false accusations to get revenge. I felt my anger building. He's trying to discredit any testimony you might give in Ruth's favor. There's more, Johnny said reluctantly. He knows about Paul, asked specific questions about how long he's been working here, whether Ruth is paying him, whether there's anything inappropriate about their relationship. The implication hit me like a physical blow. Stephen wasn't just trying to prove Ruth was mentally unstable. He was trying to suggest that her relationship with me was somehow improper or exploitative. Christine's voice was ice cold. That's sick. Bastard is trying to create a narrative where Ruth is either crazy or being taken advantage of by a predatory handyman. Ruth stood up abruptly, pacing to the fence and back. This is exactly what I was afraid of. He's going to twist everything. Make it seem like I'm some pathetic woman who can't make rational decisions. Then we make sure everyone knows the truth before he has a chance to spread lies, Astor said with determination. Johnny, I need you to write down everything Stephen said to you, word for word. Christine, we need those photos organized chronologically, with dates. What about me? Ruth asked, and I could hear the fear creeping back into her voice. You, I said, standing up and moving to her side, are going to keep being exactly who you are. Someone smart, capable, and strong enough to rebuild her life from the ground up. Astor nodded approvingly. Paul's right. But we're also going to be strategic about this. Ruth, I think it's time you called that lawyer who handled your divorce. Christine added, I think we need to expand our documentation. Not just photos of the garden, but videos of Ruth working, making decisions, demonstrating her knowledge and competence. Over the next few hours, our garden club transformed into something more like a support network with a battle plan.
After.
Revealed that she had connections throughout the neighborhood, a network of longtime residents, who respected her opinion and would listen if she vouched for Ruth's character. Mrs. Patterson may have been fooled by Stephen's concerned ex-husband act, Astor said, but she's known me for decades. When I tell her what's really going on, she'll listen. Johnny volunteered to keep a detailed log of any future encounters with Stephen, and to quietly ask other neighbors if they'd been approached with similar offers or questions. Christine suggested we organize a neighborhood garden tour, showcasing not just Ruth's transformation, but positioning her as a knowledgeable gardener who could offer advice to others. The best defense against Stephen's lies, she said, is a community that knows the real Ruth. As our meeting broke up, I found myself alone with Ruth as she walked me to my truck. The afternoon sun was filtering through the oak tree, casting dappled shadows across the garden we'd worked so hard to restore. Hey, Paul, she said quietly, I'm scared that being involved with me is going to hurt you somehow. Stephen has a way of destroying anything that makes me happy. I stopped walking and turned to face her. Ruth, I need you to understand something. Stephen Coleman doesn't get to decide what makes you happy anymore, and he sure as hell doesn't get to decide who gets to care about you. She looked up at me with those green eyes that had become so familiar, so dear. You really care about me? The question was so tentative, so vulnerable, that it broke my heart a little. Ruth, I care about you more than I've cared about anyone in a very long time. She smiled then, not the careful, guarded smile she'd worn for weeks, but something radiant and hopeful. Then we fight back? And we fight back, I confirmed. Together, as I drove away that evening, I looked back at Ruth standing in her garden, surrounded by the plants we'd nurtured back to life and the community that had rallied to protect her. Stephen Coleman had made a crucial miscalculation, he thought. He was fighting an isolated, broken woman instead. He was about to go to war with an entire neighborhood. The escalation came sooner than any of us expected. I arrived at Ruth's house Tuesday morning to find her sitting on her front porch steps, holding an official-looking envelope with shaking hands. Her face was pale, and she looked like she hadn't slept. What is it? I asked, setting down my toolbox. And sitting beside her, legal notice, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Stephen is petitioning the court to review the divorce settlement. He's claiming I've shown signs of mental instability and requesting a psychological evaluation. To determine my fitness to maintain the property, my blood turned to ice as I read over her shoulder. The document was filled with legal language. The core message was clear. Stephen was using every conversation he'd had with neighbors, every instance of erratic behavior he'd documented to build a case that Ruth was incompetent. Look at this, Ruth said, pointing to a specific paragraph. He's citing obsessive landscaping projects, inappropriate relationships with service providers, and concerning changes in social behavior as evidence of mental decline. I felt sick. Every moment of happiness Ruth had found in her garden, every friendship she'd built with our group, every sign of her recovery and growth. Stephen had twisted it all into ammunition against her. Ruth, this is garbage. Any judge will see through this, will they? Her voice cracked. Stephen's always been good at presenting his version of the truth. And look at what he's got here. Statements from neighbors about my unusual activity, questions about my spending on garden supplies, observations about how much time I spend with you. Before I could respond, Astor appeared at the garden gate, moving faster than I'd ever seen her. Ruth, honey, Johnny just told me about— Oh no. You got the papers you already knew? Ruth asked. Mrs. Patterson called me this morning. Stephen stopped by her house yesterday with some man in a suit, asking her to sign a statement about your behavior. She was confused and called me for advice. I see a— Hands clenched into fists. He's actively recruiting witnesses. It gets worse, Astor said grimly. Johnny saw him talking to the manager at the garden center, asking about your purchasing patterns. And apparently he's hired a private investigator to take photographs of your property and document who comes and goes. Ruth stood up abruptly, pacing across the porch. He's going to win, isn't he? He's going to take my grandmother's house, and there's nothing I can do to stop him. The hell he is, I said, standing up with more force than I intended. Ruth, look at me. She turned, tears streaming down her face. Stephen is counting on you falling apart right now. He wants you to believe his lies, to doubt yourself, to give up. But that's not who you are anymore, isn't it? Maybe he's right. Maybe I am making poor decisions, getting obsessed with things that don't matter. Stop. The command in my voice surprised even me. Ruth Coleman, you are one of the strongest, most capable women I've ever known. You took a garden that was destroyed and brought it back to life. You built friendships with people who genuinely care about you. You learned to trust yourself again after years of being told you couldn't trust your own judgment. Astor nodded. Vigorously, Paul's right. And we're not going to let Stephen steamroll over you again. What do you mean? Astor said with a fierce smile. That it's time Stephen Coleman learned what happens when you threaten someone this neighborhood cares about. Johnny's already started calling other neighbors, and Christine is documenting everything. We're going to fight this, Ruth. All of us. I moved closer to Ruth, taking her hands in mine. I'm going to be right here beside you, every step of the way. Stephen can twist whatever narrative he wants, but the truth is going to win. Ruth looked between me and Astor, and slowly something shifted in her expression. The fear was still there, but underneath it, I could see the steel that had helped her survive her marriage and build a new life. Okay, she said quietly. Let's fight back. The showdown came 3 days later, on a Friday morning that started deceptively peaceful. Ruth and I were installing a new trellis for her climbing roses when we heard the sound of multiple vehicles pulling up in front of the house. Through the garden gate, I could see Stephen's truck flanked by a sedan I didn't recognize. Stay calm, I murmured to Ruth, but I could feel the tension radiating from her as Stephen emerged from his truck, followed by a man in an expensive suit carrying a briefcase and camera equipment. Ruth, Stephen called out in a voice that carried false concern across the yard. I hope you don't mind, but I brought someone who wanted to see the property. The man with the briefcase was clearly the private investigator. He was already taking photos of the garden, the house, and us. Stephen walked confidently to the gate like he still had every right to be there. This is private property, Stephen, Ruth said, her voice steadier than I'd expected. You need to leave. I'm just concerned about you, sweetheart, he replied, using the pet name with deliberate cruelty. All this activity you've been up to, spending all this money on plants, having strange men around the house all day. I stepped forward. Mr. Coleman, Ruth has asked you to leave. I suggest you respect that. Stephen looked me up and down with obvious disdain. And you are? Paul Reynolds? I'm the landscaper Ruth hired to restore her grandmother's garden. Landscaper, Stephen repeated with a smirk. Is that what we're calling it? The implication in his voice was ugly and deliberate. That's when Astor appeared at her fence line. Stephen Coleman, what are you doing harassing this poor girl now? Mrs. Whitmore, Stephen turned on his charm like a switch. I'm just worried about Ruth. Surely you've noticed how erratic her behavior has become since the divorce. The only erratic behavior I've noticed, Astor said in a voice that could cut. Glass is a pathetic man who can't accept that his ex-wife is happier without him. Stephen's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the anger underneath. Ruth's always been unstable. Ask anyone who knew her during our marriage. I did ask, came a voice from behind him. Johnny had appeared with what looked like half the neighborhood. Christine, Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Chen, several other faces I recognized from around the area. Stephen turned, clearly not expecting an audience. Funny thing, Johnny continued, when I asked people about Ruth's behavior during your marriage, they had a lot to say. About the bruises she tried to hide, about how she stopped inviting people over, about how you isolated her from everyone who cared about her. That's ridiculous, Stephen sputtered. But his confidence was cracking. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, looking ashamed. I'm sorry, Ruth. When Stephen came to me with his stories, I should have known better. I should have asked you directly. We all should have, Mr. Chen added. Your grandmother would be ashamed of how we let you face this alone. I watched Stephen's face as he realized his carefully constructed narrative was falling apart. The neighbors he'd been counting on as witnesses were turning against him. This is harassment, he said, backing toward his truck. I have legal documents, and we have eyes, Astor interrupted. We can see that Ruth is thriving. Her garden is beautiful, she's making friends, and she's happier than she's been in years. The only person causing problems here is you. Stephen's investigator had stopped taking photos and was looking uncomfortable with the turn the situation had taken. Ruth, Stephen said, making one last desperate attempt. You know you can't maintain this place on your own. You need someone to take care of you. That's when Ruth surprised us all. She walked directly up to the gate, her chin raised and her voice clear. Stephen, I want you to listen very carefully. I don't need you to take care of me. I never did. What I needed was for you to stop hurting me, and since you couldn't do that, I chose to live without you. She gestured toward our group of neighbors. These people care about me without trying to control me. Paul helps me without demanding I become someone else. This is what healthy relationships look like. Stephen's face flushed red. You'll regret this, Ruth. All of you will regret interfering in things you don't understand. Is that a threat? I asked, stepping up beside Ruth. Stephen looked around at the circle of determined faces surrounding him and seemed to realize he was outnumbered. He got back in his truck, but before driving away, he rolled down his window. The court date is set, Ruth. We'll see what a judge thinks about your stable behavior. As his truck disappeared down the street, the neighborhood slowly dispersed, each person stopping to hug Ruth and offer support. When it was just Ruth and me standing in her garden, she turned to me with tears in her eyes. Do you think we really won that? I looked around at the thriving garden, at the house where she was finally free to be herself, at the community that had rallied to protect her. Yeah, I said. I think we did. 6 months later, I stood in Ruth's garden on a warm September morning, watching her teach a group of neighborhood children how to harvest tomatoes. The transformation wasn't just in the space around us, though. The garden had become the showcase of Maple Street, but in Ruth herself. Gone was the hesitant, apologetic woman I'd met that first day. In her place stood someone confident and radiant, her hands sure as she showed 8-year-old Emma Patterson how to tell when a tomato was perfectly ripe. The secret, Ruth was saying, is that they should give just a little when you press gently. They'll smell sweet at the stem. End. Emma nodded seriously, treating this gardening lesson like it was the most important information in the world. Her grandmother, Mrs. Patterson, watched from the garden bench with a smile that held equal parts affection and guilt. Guilt that had led to some of the most heartfelt apologies I'd ever witnessed. The legal battle had ended almost anticlimactically. When Stephen's case came before the judge, his private investigator had been forced to admit that all his documentation showed was a woman improving her property and building healthy relationships. The neighborhood's testimony, led by Astor's fierce advocacy and Johnny's detailed logs, had painted such a clear picture of Stephen's harassment that the judge had not only dismissed his petition, but issued a restraining order. Mr. Coleman, the judge had said, it appears the only instability in evidence here is your inability to accept that your ex-wife has moved on with her life. Stephen had left town shortly after, taking a construction job in another state. The relief in Ruth's eyes when Astor had called with that news was something I'd never forget. Now, watching Ruth in her element, I marveled at how completely she'd reclaimed not just her garden but herself. The neighborhood garden club she'd started had grown to include families from 3 surrounding blocks. Her expertise in heirloom varieties had led to her consulting for other restoration projects around Millfield. "Paul," Ruth called, pulling me from my reverie, "could you help Emma carry her basket?" I think she picked enough tomatoes to feed the whole neighborhood. As I walked over to the little girl struggling with her overflowing harvest basket, I caught Ruth's eye and felt that familiar flutter in my chest. What had started as a professional job had become the center of my world, Miss Ruth, Emma said seriously. "My mom wants to know if you could help her start a herb garden like yours." "I'd love to," Ruth replied. "But I think you should ask Paul. Too, he's the one who taught me that broken things can grow back even stronger than before." The words hung in the air between us, loaded with meaning that went far beyond gardening. Ruth had never directly acknowledged what everyone in the neighborhood could see, that somewhere between the soil amendments and the morning coffee conversations, we'd fallen in love. Later that evening, after the children had gone home with their treasure troves of vegetables, and the last of the garden club members had dispersed, Ruth and I found ourselves alone under the oak tree where we'd shared so many conversations. "I have something to tell you," she said, her voice carrying a nervousness I hadn't heard in months. My heart jumped. "Hey, what is it?" "The house. I've been thinking about it a lot since the court case ended. This place, this garden, it's not just mine anymore. It belongs to everyone who helped save it. Everyone who fought for it." She turned to face me fully, her green eyes serious in the fading light. "But mostly it belongs to you and me. Together if that's something you'd want." The question she was really asking hung in the air between us, and I felt a smile spreading across my face. "Ruth Coleman," I said, reaching for her hands, "I can't think of anything I'd want more than to help you tend this garden for the rest of our lives." When she smiled back at me, radiant and unguarded, I knew that we'd both found something worth nurturing. Something that would grow stronger and more beautiful with each passing season. 2 years have passed since that first morning, when I arrived at 847 Maple Street to fix what I thought was just a broken garden. Ruth and I were married last spring in a ceremony held right here under her grandmother's oak tree. Surrounded by the friends who had become our family and the flowers we'd nurtured back to life together, as I write this, I'm sitting in what used to be just Ruth's garden, but is now truly ours. The roses her grandmother planted 60 years ago are blooming again, their petals more vibrant than ever. The herb garden where Ruth once feared to plant anything now supplies half the neighborhood with basil and oregano. The tomatoes that Stephen once destroyed are thriving in raised beds that Johnny helped us build. But the real transformation isn't in the plants, or the soil, or even the beautiful space we've created together. It's in Ruth herself, and if I'm being honest, in me too. When I first met Ruth, she was a woman who had been convinced that everything she touched would die, that she wasn't worthy of patience, kindness, or love, that broken things, including herself, weren't worth the effort it took to heal them. And maybe that's why I'm telling you this story, because if you're listening to this, there's a chance you might feel the same way sometimes. Maybe you've been told that you're too damaged, too difficult, too much work. Maybe someone has convinced you that love comes with conditions, with control, with the constant threat of having it taken away. I want you to know something, and I need you to really hear this. That's not love. Love doesn't demand that you make yourself smaller to deserve it. Love doesn't punish you for growing, for changing, for becoming the person you were meant to be. Real love, the kind worth having, is patient. It believes in your potential even when you can't see it yourself. It celebrates your healing instead of trying to keep your wounds open. Ruth taught me that broken things can indeed become more beautiful than they ever were before, but only when they're given the right conditions to grow. Safety, patience, care, time, and most importantly, the belief that they deserve to flourish. Every morning when I wake up in this house that Ruth almost lost, in this garden we rebuilt together, I'm reminded that the best things in life often come disguised as problems that need solving. What started as a fence repair job in my old story has taught me something profound. Sometimes the most meaningful work we do isn't about fixing what's broken, but about recognizing what was never broken in the first place. Ruth wasn't broken when I met her. She was buried, maybe hidden under years of being told she wasn't enough. But like those rose bushes that survived Stephen's sabotage, her roots were strong. She just needed someone who was willing to clear away the debris and give her room to grow. And you're not broken either. Whatever has happened to you, whatever you've been told about yourself, whatever mistakes you think you've made, none of that changes your fundamental worth. You deserve patience. You deserve kindness. You deserve love that builds you up instead of tearing you down. If this story has taught me anything, it's that there are people out there who will see your potential and want to help you reach it. People who will stand with you when the bullies come calling. People who will choose you, not despite your past, but because of who you're becoming. Sometimes fixing a garden isn't just about wood and nails and soil. Sometimes it's about fixing the broken parts of life, one patient day at a time. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you get to build something beautiful with someone who understands that the best things in life are worth taking your time with. Trust me on this. You're worth that kind of patience. You're worth that kind of love. And somewhere out there in a garden you haven't planted yet, your happiness is waiting to bloom. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.